The French government is forced to backtrack on Article 24. Controversial legislation aimed at protecting the police will be rewritten after protesters argued it would erode civil liberties. But will a redrafted law still limit police accountability? I'm Ali Hassan, and today's newsmaker is Emmanuel Macron's global security bill. France's Article 24 would have made it illegal to share videos of police officers if they could be identified and there was an intent to cause harm. But that opens up a pretty wide grey area, and it likely would have outlawed images like these. This video shows 4 French policemen beating up black music producer Michel Zecler in a studio in Paris. It's been viewed more than 14 million times. Macron says the images shame France as a nation, and yet they might have never come to light if his proposed law had been passed. And the people responsible for uploading this footage could have been jailed. A week of mass demonstrations against the bill were violently cracked down on by police. The EU and the UN also opposed the legislation, as did human rights groups and media outlets. They all argued Article 24's ambiguity would allow the police to operate with impunity and prevent journalists from doing their job. Critics also say the bill would have expanded the state's right to monitor its own citizens, putting the republic's fundamental freedoms in jeopardy.
It's a law, as we saw again with what happened to Michel 2 days ago, that by suppressing our right to film what happens with the police, we no longer have evidence. Obviously, police forces will always speak words that will weigh more heavily. In legal terms, we cannot be heard if we don't have sufficient evidence to deny what the police is saying.
In response to the backlash, the government says it's going back to the drawing board to redraft the law. But it isn't going away. To discuss the situation, we're joined by Anne-Elisabeth Moutet in Paris. She's a journalist and columnist with the Daily Telegraph. And Philippe Marliere is a professor of French and European politics at University College London. Anne, this law, proposed global security bill by French President Macron, would make it illegal to publish images of on-duty police officers. That seems rather strange. What do you make of this law?
Well, and I'm not defending the law, but I think it's stupid. But still, what it says is that if there is intent to use those pictures to threaten their lives or their families, and this happened, this was inserted in the law partly because police unions wanted this, because there have been very often footage and photographs not only of themselves but their children and their wives put on social media, and they've received threats. And their families have received threats. Now, what any sort of legal expert will say is that death threats and generally sort of, bullying, cyberbullying is already illegal, and you didn't need an extra law, an extra article in the law to make it more illegal. It already is. The government is stepping back. I'm sure we're going to talk about this, because they've now realized that they have inflicted a complete own goal on themselves. There's a general law about security. Some aspects of it are actually necessary. Some others, probably there already was legislation, but the French have this illness in which, just in case something goes wrong, you write up an entirely new law, even though a great deal of what's in the law already exists. In this specific instance, it's the first major unrest of this year, after and when I say after, during the ongoing COVID crisis, and it's a political failure for President Macron.
And indeed, Philip, advocates and proponents of this bill say it will protect police from harassment, and says it gives greater protection to police officers. Is that an argument that you follow?
Well, again, I think it's a pretty weak one if it's an argument, because clearly there is legislation in France already in place to make sure that anyone whose name and ID is branded publicly in a social media, and with a view to intimidating or even threatening a person can be prosecuted. So I don't think you need yet another law, particularly this law, because you have to look at both sides of the argument. If the positive side of it is to protect the police, clearly the other side is that if you do that, if you pass this law, then the media and also the public at large will lose the right to inform about police violence, and there's plenty of it. And I think just no later than last week and this week again, there were a couple of very awful interventions on the part of the police, notably against this music producer. And I think that the whole of France was revolted, very shocked by it. So I think really that has clearly undermined all the argumentation of the government. Clearly, one needs to make sure that the law doesn't prevent people from informing about police violence, because this is clearly something happening.
And indeed, the police brutality that you spoke of and the images that we have seen going into the show, of course, would have never seen the lights of the day, and if it were for this law.
Actually, I think this comes into the provisions of the law, because you don't see the faces of the policemen. You do see an illegal act. And 3 of the 4 policemen are still in police custody right now, and being interrogated by investigative magistrates, and they're facing jail terms. So you could have filmed that. It's more the chilling effect that is really in question. It's the fact that because it's easy to arrest somebody with a telephone taking pictures and say you're in breach of the law. It's impossible to recognize them. You can see that. You're in breach of the law. That fewer people will dare do it because they don't want to fall foul of people who are capable of doing what we're seeing right now on the screen. But legally, it is perfectly legal to take that. Even under Article 24, it's perfectly legal to take that video.
Under the law, Philip, interestingly enough, for those who would offend and go against this law, offenders could face up to a year in prison and be fined up to 50,000 euros. That seems quite excessive, doesn't it?
It is quite excessive. I think the whole purpose of the law is to make sure that no one dares to use this arguably right of filming the police, because that's what the government says. In the end, people will still be able to film the police. It's just the question is, it's about ill intent. You've got to be filming the police with an intention to harm policemen. But of course, who will prove that? I think it will be essentially the courts, justice, but also the police, when in action, will say, well, look, you're filming, you are filming me, and I can see that you're doing that with an ill intent. So imagine people, filming the public, the media. I think probably they will stop from doing that, because of course no one will want the risk to be prosecuted for it. That's why it's all about threatening before anyone can have a chance to film the police. So the right should be there in theory, but in practice, it's about really to make sure that no one will use it. So that's why in the end, Article 24 is not sustainable. That's why you've got so much opposition to it, and that's why the government had to back off and rewrite it. That's not the end of the story, by the way, because I don't think they will give up just now. But clearly, the mere fact that they've had now to concede that is already a sign of weakness.
Sign of weakness, and which President Macron, of course, would hate to reveal and expose at this particular juncture, a year and a half before his re-election campaign. But let's look at his motivations for introducing this law in the first place. What do you think is the driving force and the driving factor here?
First of all, the one thing, we've seen lots of footage of recent demonstrations in Paris. What we haven't seen is footage of incredible violence against policemen. Actually, you had 28 policemen who were injured, some of them badly, in the last demonstrations last weekend. And there you have to take into account the fact that there is unrest in France and has been unrest in France. It's a French tradition, but it's sort of crossing over the line. And we had almost 2 years of yellow vest demonstrations, which started as a perfectly understandable movement and which ended as a sort of nihilistic movement of the toughest with a considerable destruction to property, but also injuring police. I follow the Twitter feeds of individual police men and women. I mean, they have pseudonyms, but they tell you what it's like, and they do a sort of fascinating live blog of what it's like to be inside, faced with that violence. This is not what we're seeing now on the screen, but they were afraid for their lives. You have to realize that of all professional categories in France, the one where there's the most suicides is the police. The police is underfunded, underworked, underpaid, and not paid in time. And that's a real problem for Emmanuel Macron. And I think he wanted to tell them that, and he'd understood them. And then the bill was written by his MPs with guidance from ministers, which in itself is a strange way of proceeding. And last 4 days ago, there was a serious sort of meeting with his ministers in which he essentially started apportioning blame to everyone but himself, saying that they completely made a mess of this. And he now is trying to revert a process in Parliament that's already started, in which you pass a bill, it's read by the National Assembly, it goes to the upper house, the Senate, and then because this is within the emergency measures about security in France, it's not supposed to go back to the National Assembly. So he wants a rewrite which is not written into the emergency procedure in which they decided to make that law. It's not well done. It's not helpful. People notice this. People right and left do not like the idea of civil liberties being curtailed, and so he's in a political crisis of his own making.
A crisis of his own making, says Anne. Philippe, you've already said the last word has not been spoken here on this particular bill. It's going back to the drawing boards, something that even President Macron acknowledges that some improvements have to be made. What do you think the ultimate fate of this bill will be?
It's hard to tell right now. I think probably it would be good on the part of Macron and the government to realize that clearly there's massive opposition to it. I mean, left and right, the whole spectrum of the French media oppose the law as well, and Article 24 notably, which is very unique in France. So I think there is a problem there. So probably I think a modern government would pause and realize that probably it is better to give up on a bad law, very poorly written indeed, very poorly thought out, instead of pushing through it and in force. But I'm afraid that Macron might decide to do that because there are quite a few hardliners in his government, the Minister of the Interior notably. And if he does that, well, probably we shall see. But I think he may have to pay a high political cost for it, in the name of, for instance, losing the next presidential election in less than 2 years' time, because people will be so angry about it, the media will be so resentful about it, that of course it will be something which will pursue him until at the very least is the next presidential campaign.
Yeah, next presidential campaign, of course, is looming, and he seems to be feeling the heat. This seems to be, Anne, before we go, seems to be an effort on his part to sort of present himself and reinvent himself as a more conservative political figure. Is this to fend off the political attacks and threats from the right?
Actually, the French right is weak and disorganized, so I don't think it's so much that. It's more that public opinion has had it with the unrest in the country, with anything from small criminality to the kind of disorder that we've seen with the yellow vest. Again, a very valid, even beautiful cause that degenerated into weekly violence Saturday after Saturday. And he's answering, he's got pollsters, and his pollsters are telling him people are angry. I think it's going to be a mix of many things in a year and a half. I think a week is a long time in politics. So 18 months is a very long time in politics. And I think he's counting on this. That the French system is very strange. You've got a free-for-all in the first round, and then you've got a runoff. And at the runoff, the two people who poll the most votes, so the two of them are pitted against one another. And one of them is going to be Marine Le Pen, who is perceived as incompetent, but people vote for her because they're generally angry and there's populist appeal. And then Macron or two or three other candidates really are within 1 or 2 percentage points. So there's question of sheer blind luck on this one as well, and the mood of the people the day when they go to vote. It is completely vague and blurred, and we have no idea who gets elected. Macron could be re-elected or not.
Of course, 18 months, as you said, very, very long time in politics indeed. Nonetheless, Philippe Marliere and Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, thank you so much for shedding light and giving some analysis and backdrop on the global security bill.